he saw, like Teddy Roosevelt, he saw hunting on the plains as kind of a way of preserving white masculinity, which was thought to be threatened at the time by the move from manual labor to office work. Men needed to be out on the plains, chasing wild beasts and getting their red blood flowing in order to preserve their, in order to preserve what was important about masculinity, and specifically white masculinity. So these.
Welcome to another edition of Just the Facts, and we're delighted to have Michelle Nijhuis today. And our interviewer and host is Ted Alk.
Thanks for joining us, Michelle. So Michelle is the author of Beloved Beasts: Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction, and she's actually going to be speaking to our Fact Distinguished Speaker Series this coming Saturday, May 6th at 2 p.m. I unfortunately will not be able to make that because we have a baseball game. My 9.5-year-old has a baseball game, but
Excellent excuse.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Michelle, first off, for joining us. So I guess my first question would be just a little bit of background from you as to how you got to the point of writing a book about this beautiful beast book that you wrote. How did you get to this point? A little bit of a story of your story arc.
Sure. Well, I studied biology in college with the not exactly well-articulated idea that I might write about it someday. I was very interested in writing, wasn't too interested in studying literary theory, was very interested in the environment and wildlife, and thought that might give me something to write about, which sounds perhaps a little more organized than I actually was about my ambitions. But after college, I did work as an assistant on wildlife research projects, mostly in the desert Southwest. I worked on tortoises. I worked on looking at the recovery of plant communities after wildfire. And those were great jobs, but they really, what they really taught me was how political conservation could be, especially in the rural West. And just how passionately people on all sides felt about things like endangered species. And I, over time, became a journalist. I started listening in on those kinds of debates as a journalist and reporting on them. And I felt, just a sense of, they continued to be fascinating to me, but they were also frustrating because I kept feeling like people were fighting over the same big questions. Why should we protect species? Whose responsibility is it? Who should shoulder the costs? And I thought that, I had this vague idea that that people in the past had debated some of these questions and come to at least provisional answers. Not that I thought that anyone had figured them out exhaustively, but I started to think it might be useful to tell the story of the modern conservation movement and look at how people in our own society had answered those questions and see what we could learn from those answers. I didn't think that those answers were perfect. And I knew that the conservation movement had overlooked a lot of things. But I thought it was worth looking at how the conservation movement had evolved over time. And that turned out to be a really interesting journey with a lot of surprises for me.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because there's been a through line in the speaker series to date of megafaunas, focusing on megafauna. We've had two speakers on it. We had Ross McPhee, who wrote the book End of the Megafauna last year, and then we had a speaker that talked about bison and pronghorn sheep and some of the species out west. So there's where I guess it's maybe, since I've been kind of leading the speaker series, it's probably just that I have an interest in megafauna. So that's and I'm kind of an amateur biologist. I have a PhD in environmental science, but I've been a long time birder. So this book really drew me in on multiple levels. I guess my first question is because I think it's, you spend a lot of time, explicitly and kind of alluding to this topic, which I think is really fascinating. The idea about the phrase charismatic megafauna and the role that concept has played in preservation. And maybe, I guess I'm wondering what you think about the cost benefits of that phrase. I'm thinking specifically about like the focus on species at the expense of maybe the entire ecosystem, or vice versa? Like, where does this conversation and what you wrote about revolve around that concept? And you're, after having written this book and researched it, that concept, how does it still sit with you? If that,
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's important to say from the outset that my book is about the modern conservation movement, or you could call it the institutional conservation movement. And of course, humans have been practicing different forms of conservation since time immemorial at the local level. And many of those were not focused on charismatic megafauna. They were focused on simply sustaining what we now call the ecosystem so that people could continue to survive within it. But the modern conservation movement, I think so-called charismatic megafauna, such as the American bison, or the great auk, which maybe is not a typically charismatic species, but was noticeable because it was in such great numbers and then declined so quickly in the North Atlantic. The decline and eventual near disappearance or disappearance of those species really brought the problem of extinction and then the larger problem of conservation or challenge of conservation to the attention of people in wealthy societies in North America and Europe, people who hadn't had to worry so much about preserving the ecosystems for their own survival because their dependence on ecosystems was much less direct than it used to be, right? So I suppose the modern conservation movement has been focused on charismatic megafauna just because they're so showy. People love them. Their attention is drawn to them. Their disappearance is noticeable, whether it's that they exist in great numbers or they're very large in size. And at least in the case of the American bison, the people who stepped up to protect the American bison from extinction really saw it as a symbol of much more than, they saw it as a symbol of larger issues rather than simply what it was, which was a fellow creature sharing an ecosystem with us. So I think that, and just to be more specific about that, they really saw it as a symbol of national pride for a new nation, and in some cases their views were explicitly racist. They saw it as its preservation as something that was important to the protection of the white race. So I think the concept of charismatic megafauna, has served conservation in some ways, but it's also biased our view of what the job of conservation is. There's all kinds of studies showing that we continue to spend more money on the conservation of large species or highly endangered species, which is, I guess, another form of charisma, the sort of desperate plight of certain species. And we forget about species that might be even more important in terms of their ecological role, but aren't as colorful or showy or unusual. And I think it's a mixed bag. And you see that mixed bag, I think, in the campaigns today of environmental groups who, use charismatic creatures on their calendars and on their, on their materials that they use to recruit members and recruit support. But they know that is a bit of a trade-off because they're not communicating their real goal very clearly, and their real goal being the preservation of all life.
Yeah. I was thinking about, I was in Texas last December down in Corpus Christi in the Aransas Wildlife Refuge, where there's a lot of oil and gas infrastructure. I do a lot of work on that and its impacts on the environment, people, water, all that kind of thing. And while I was down there, because Exxon's building this big cracker plant and LNG terminal and all this stuff, and it's all taking place in and around or adjacent to the wildlife refuge, which also happens to be where the whooping crane winters.
Yep.
And I, as a longtime birder, was fortunate enough to be down there, and the people that hosted me brought me around, and we saw a couple whooping cranes, and as someone,
cool. How special.
yeah, it was really amazing. It was like we were sitting there, we were at this one site and we're just waiting around and didn't see anything. It was like 5:30 in the morning, and the fog was lifting, and all of a sudden you just see from the north they kind of fly in, two of them, and it was really, it was a heavenly moment. It really was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So it draws
Yep.
all of us in, these charismatic species, for sure.
Oh, sure. And I would never deny the magic of those kinds of experiences. And, and I think perhaps there's perhaps we're deeply wired to notice those kinds of creatures. And I just think it's the job of conservationists, I suppose, to keep reminding people that is an entry point into the wonder of the natural world. And I think anyone who studies any kind of, typically non-charismatic species, like, I met a researcher at the University of Oklahoma recently who studies ground nesting bees, and you have never met someone more excited about their taxon and talking to him, I felt like, wow, I really should know more about ground nesting bees. They're amazing. But it takes more time to appreciate those kinds of creatures. So hopefully charismatic megafauna are, like I said, just an entry into the bigger and perhaps more subtle wonders that are out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a friend who works on the hellbender salamander in Appalachia.
Oh yeah, they're great too.
And that person is equally. I see your ground nesting bee, and I match you this hellbender guy, because his excitement is like, it's so contagious. And we're hoping to actually introduce my kids to a couple of hellbenders, which would be really exciting.
Well,
so.
And they are very kid friendly. There's a unrelated but similarly sort of kind of horrifyingly charismatic creature here in the Pacific Northwest called the lamprey, and it's an eel-like, very ancient creature, lives in the Columbia River, and there's a really popular exhibit at the Oregon Zoo on the lamprey, so kids are flocking to it. So I hope your kids like the hellbender.
Yeah, I think they will. So another part of this is another part of the through line of this book is also discussing kind of the cast of characters that were responsible for the conservation movement. I'm thinking back to, some of what I know about, Hornaday, Roosevelt, even John Muir and some of these folks, and like their role in conservation. And I was wondering if you could kind of give a little background on what you found in reading about these people. Because as you said, there was a headline reason in which they were doing what they were doing. And then in many respects, there was some, like, a dark underbelly is what I would kind of call it, of like why they did it. Maybe if you could kind of describe some of those folks and what you discovered with them.
Yeah, of course. And I'll say at the outset, I find these people fascinating, even when they horrify me, because, to us, and even at the time, some of their motivations were, as you say, quite dark. But that was always set alongside, what to them, and I think we can say now, we can see even from our perspective that they had great insights, that were very positive. And so the contradiction continues to fascinate and frustrate me. Hornaday is a good example. He was a trophy hunter of all things, traveled the world, shooting, again, charismatic megafauna for sale to museums who at the time, didn't have access to, people didn't have access to film and high quality photography. So the only way for people who didn't live near some of these amazing animals, the only way for them to get a real sense of what they were like was to see, preserved specimens. So these specimens were in high demand. And Hornaday came to the Smithsonian as a taxidermist, and he realized that the bison had become so rare through market hunting on the Great Plains that the Smithsonian couldn't get hold of any decent specimens. And so he describes this moment as a hammer blow to the head. He woke up, decided that he was going to dedicate much of the rest of his life to preserving the bison, eventually restored a herd of bison to the Great Plains. And some of the bison that are on the plains today are descendants of those bison. So he had a significant, he wasn't the only person who fought to save the species, but he had a significant role in preserving the species. And he's one of the reasons why we have, several 100,000 bison on the plains today. They're not what they once were by any means, but they're not in danger of extinction. The irony is that Hornaday wanted to preserve the species because he admired it. I think he had a genuine love for other species, but he also saw it, as I mentioned earlier, as a a symbol, an issue of national pride, not to let this majestic species go extinct. He saw, like Teddy Roosevelt, he saw hunting on the plains as kind of a way of preserving white masculinity, which was thought to be threatened at the time by the move from manual labor to office work. Men needed to be out on the plains, chasing wild beasts and getting their red blood flowing in order to preserve their, in order to preserve what was important about masculinity, and specifically white masculinity. So these motivations are things that we would, at the very least, look askance at today. And Hornaday, even worse, was, very dismissive of immigrants and indigenous people who were subsistence hunters. He blamed subsistence hunters for the loss of much of today's wildlife, including the bison. So he was really just very turned around about the reasons for the bison's decline and about the reasons for protecting it. That said, the fact that we have several 100,000 bison on the plains today has made it possible for there to be a really exciting, to my mind, this is one of the most exciting things happening in conservation today, is that there's an indigenous-led multinational effort to bring the bison back on an ecosystem level, to restore something like its old migration patterns and to kind of finish the job. Hornaday didn't have a sense of the bison's ecological place on the prairie. And he certainly didn't have a sense of its cultural importance to indigenous tribes. And so the fact that this is tribally led, that this is both a cultural and an ecological restoration, is really exciting to me. And it wouldn't have been possible without, Hornaday, who was full of so much darkness and so many bad ideas, but yet had the insight and the determination to keep this species on the planet.
Yeah, no, that's kind of the through line. I read a lot. I've read a lot of books about eugenics and stuff like that. And there's there's all these tentacles that connect all these people. And it's like, it's hard to square the circle with like what was a result, as you said, of like, what was it? It was like, 300 or 400 of them left, and he found them in some valley in Montana or something like that. Is that?
Yeah. He at the very first, when he first became aware of the plight of the bison, he went to Montana and spent weeks. Yes, Hornaday went to Montana and spent weeks looking for bison to shoot as specimens to take back to the Smithsonian, which, is is not the first thing most of us would think of when we were trying to save a species, is to go out and shoot several dozen of the, one of the last remaining populations. But yeah, that's what he did. And you could argue that by doing that, he brought the plight of the bison and the stakes of that fight to urban North America, because he allowed people to see the size of the bison. The way he set up his displays was very progressive. It gave a sense of the bison's habitat. They were in a family group. They weren't just isolated by themselves. Millions of people came to see it. So, it's really hard to say in retrospect how crucial that was. It seems so wrongheaded to us at the time, from our modern perspective. But that might have been a crucial ingredient in the campaign that he put together.
Is that diorama anywhere today?
Yeah, it is. Oh. I went to see it actually in Montana. It was in the Smithsonian for decades. And they finally, when was it? I want to say it was in the 70s or 80s that they dismantled it, because it was, by then like extremely out of date and hadn't been on public display for a while. They dismantled it, and under the fake prairie that Hornaday had constructed, he had left a note to future. And it was this very sort of, comment. It was very Hornaday. It was very kind of humble yet arrogant, saying, future museum professionals, you might not think much of this, but, know that it was really important in its time. And this note actually had its intended effect, because I think the museum officials were just going to, dismantle it and discard of it in some way because they thought, well, okay, this has served its time. We have other things to replace it. And they ended up sending it to Montana, and where the animals were kind of scattered all over in local museums. And then in recent decades, they've been recollected, and the diorama has been reconstructed for historical interest. And you can go see it today. And it really does give you a sense of what it might have been like to be a sightseer back in the late 1800s and looking into the eyes of the bison, because they follow you around the room, and it's quite a dramatic effect. You can get closer to these, facsimiles of bison than, any wise person should get to a live bison. So you do get a great idea of how grand they are.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, so I live in Cleveland, and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History used to have those old school dioramas, and they're I don't know what there's massive expansion of the facility, but my kids, there are all these fancy ones from far off lands, but my son, my 9.5-year-old, was always drawn to the bison one because it was, it was at eye level, and the bison were like little figurines, and then the background was all brown, and the concept of like 30 or 40 million, whatever they call it, these ecosystem engineers just roaming the lands, is just the sheer volume for him was just kind of mind blowing.
It's incredible to think about.
Yeah.
Yep.
What about, kind of, you were talking about at the beginning, the politics of conservation and the bison and masculinity, and probably even toxic masculinity. I'm always struck by like some of these people that have and I don't do Twitter anymore, but when I did, there were all these Twitter handles with eagles and bison and guns and flags and all that stuff. And they managed to kind of commingle all this stuff. And it's like, I think to that, and I think about like the Bundys and the Bundy family, and they're grazing on federal lands and all that stuff. It's like, how does conservation, I mean, I know that there's the hunter thread that you can appeal to, but how does conservation attempt to engage that section of society, that group of people that view these as kinds of resources to be taken? Like, how would you, you must have thought about that a lot. How do you engage the people that aren't in our umbrella?
Right. And that is really interesting. And it's true. I mean, these animals remain very powerful symbols, and they mean different things to different people. All you have to do is look at the names of sports teams to know what we think of many different species. Let's see. It's a complicated question. I would say that those biases, or those associations between powerful animals and violence and toxic masculinity, those have been part of the conservation movement from the beginning in many ways. And, we talked about Hornaday. That was one of the reasons for his interest in those species. And I think the conservation movement then in later decades went on to embrace other species that perhaps people might have negative associations with, might not see them as quite so powerful or so masculine. And that's mostly because of the rise of ecology. People realized that the science of ecology, that is, people realized that all species were important because they were all connected to one another. I think that the elitism that's at the roots of the modern conservation movement, even perhaps more so than that sexism and that racism, they're all connected, of course, but I think it's the elitism that has most limited the reach of the conservation movement, because it, from the start, discounted subsistence hunters, discounted people who, in many ways knew way more about conservation, at least on a local level, than many of the first institutional conservationists. And that has been something that, as I said, limited the reach of the movement, both in North America and Europe. And then in later years, as it went international and went into colonized territory, there were so many missed opportunities. And then, followed by major human tragedies where white conservationists went to work with colonial governments in Africa and just dismiss the possibility that the people there might already be practicing some form of conservation, plunked down a national park that ended up dispossessing people and often doing no good for the species of concern. So I think that one thing the conservation movement can do is to recognize that what it's trying to do is protect connections, not only among other species and among species in their habitats, but between species and between humans and other species. And it's been late in doing that. It's, it's really defaulted to these top-down solutions, these kind of, erecting boundaries to protect humans or to protect other species from humans. That's been its default for some good reasons and then other not so good reasons. And I think by expanding its strategies, it can perhaps appeal to people who have been historically left out of the conservation movement or seen as not part of the conservation movement when they in fact do care a great deal about other species. I mean, I think I have no love and a lot of problems with the Bundy's strategies. Unfortunately, I live in the Bundy's neighborhood and have been affected by what they're up to in many different ways. But I do think that they care about their own ecosystem in a way that if, people who label themselves as conservationists were able to sit down and have an honest discussion with them, they might recognize. Not that I'm suggesting that it would be worthwhile to do that, but I am suggesting that I think, were you able to give people a truth serum and ask them, do you really want these species that you grew up with to go extinct on your watch? I think most people would say no. They might say, I hate how the government is managing them. I hate how they're costing me money for one reason or another. I've come to associate them with some kind of politics that are revolting to me. All of that stuff might be there, but if you could really get down to, do you have a problem? Do you want to see this animal go away? I think most people would say no.
Yeah. So you're in the Pacific Northwest. So a conversation about species, charismatic species, and otherwise, with someone in the Pacific Northwest wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about the spotted owl and like the role that I'm old enough to remember it, and I remember as an environmentalist myself then and now, thinking to myself from a distance, living in Vermont, like this didn't look good. Like no one won, and that it seemed like it was a lot of losers, and it was just. I don't know what, like that seemed like a pivot point in the movement. And like, maybe from your vantage point, if you could nest that debate and what you just said about appealing to those people into the book that you've written, like what's your view on how that all rolled out?
Yeah, I think there is a deep connection there because I think that the historical elitism of the conservation movement made it vulnerable to the manipulations of timber companies and other companies who were involved in similar fights. And timber companies very cleverly saw that the concerns of environmentalists or conservationists could be pitted against the concerns of working class people. Because, like I said, historically, the conservation movement, despite its potential for it to be much more inclusive, has not been a movement that includes the working class. The environmental movement has more urban and working class roots, but even those have been somewhat forgotten over the years. So it was, the timber companies, I think, during the spotted owl fight, which I'm also old enough to remember, were very successful in scaring the crap out of timber workers who, with very good reasons, didn't want to lose their jobs. And instead of, being able to see that managing the forest sustainably was going to be good for their jobs in the long term, it found it very easy to blame these grubby kids and these, people that they saw as very snobby and not understanding the challenges that they themselves faced. It was very easy for them to blame their fears on those folks instead of on the timber companies that were mismanaging the forests. So I see it as another. I think, again, I don't mean to blame everything on the mistakes of the conservation movement. There was a lot of good work done. I think by the environmental movement, by the conservation movement, and ultimately there were some wins in that fight. But I think it's a vulnerability in the conservation movement that we still need to address.
Yeah, for sure. Have you ever heard of a book called Beyond the Rangeland Conflict by Dan Daggett? You ever heard of that book?
Yes, I have, and I know I have read it, but it's been many years. So I'm remembering this is about the radical center that kind of rose in the 1990s, looking at how conservationists could collaborate with public lands, ranchers. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I know. I just think about that because that was the first time I was living in Vermont and Burlington, a liberal bubble, which I've since left, and I'm glad I have. I loved it there, but it was very insulated. And I remember being part of the environmental movement, taking environmental, ecology classes, environmental science classes in a liberal town, feeling like dangerously disconnected at some point from what was really going on by way of the spotted owl fight. But then, having read that book, I was like, wow, that isn't truth serum that we, like, on this side of the aisle or whatever the case may be, need to like consume. Because it was like it struck me that it was like very, they framed it around like there's supply and demand for things. And it's like, we're producing because you're demanding it. Like, we're producing beef or whatever the case may be because you want beef. And like, so to blame one side of the ledger on that and not have any onus put on the other side is kind of, as you said, it's kind of like a little bit like dishonest. So anyway, I was struck by what you're talking about with like the Bundys and stuff. Is there is this through line of there's this kind of theme with people like that I wouldn't doubt for a second that they have like they have an affinity for the land. They've used the land, they've managed the land. So I find it it's a really fascinating topic. I guess with the Bundys, I was just interested that like when they were in Oregon, they had that whole site hold up with their guns. The only thing I could think about was if they were black, they wouldn't have made it like a day. Like, they would have been like taken out. So
Well, and the local indigenous folks were extremely quick to say, "You want your land back? That's interesting." So yes, I mean, I no credit to the Bundys at all, but more just, I think it's worth recognizing that most people have a genuine connection to the land. And I think, that conversation between conservationists and ranchers that started in the 1990s, there were some parts of it I didn't agree with. I saw it as, how do I say this? I saw it as sometimes not recognizing the natural limits of the land, in that when you're talking about ranching in a desert, there are some limits, and there are increasing, and then those limits are increasingly harsh when in our changing climate. But I think that was a really good development in the conservation movement. And I think it's gone much further now in terms of not just talking with the quote unquote other side, but actually looking at the power dynamics more holistically and saying, okay, how can we, not just come up with a top-down solution that's acceptable to everyone involved in the discussion, but how can we actually like come up with a solution that has, how can we broaden the discussion to involve more people and come up with a solution that actually has wide support at the grassroots.
Right.
And I think, so I think the conservation movement is starting to recognize that those kinds of more radical transformations have to take place.
Yeah. So you're kind of alluding to the whole carrying capacity of the system, right? It's like,
yeah, I think that there were times when I think that discussion lost sight of the fact that we were talking about a use of arid landscapes that might not be appropriate at any level and might not be appropriate at an economically functional level.
right.
And in that case, there was not a lot of room for compromise, and you needed to go to a more systemic solution. I think there is one sort of go to attack line from corporate interests is to say, well, you use a cell phone, so you can't complain about this mine. You eat beef, so you can't complain about this kind of grazing. And I think that that's important for conservationists to be on the alert for, because that can lead people to say, oh, well, I guess I have no say in this discussion. But I think that creates a false dichotomy and prevents people from asking, well, yes, that's true, but is there a better way to raise cows? Is there a better way to mine? Can this be done in a way that isn't quite so harmful?
Yeah. And how is the carrying capacity going to change with climate change as more and more of that land gets desertified and stuff like that?
Exactly. And, perhaps this land can be used, I think that in many cases, the great challenge of the conservation movement is to help people live sustainably within their ecosystems. And so I think it was extremely well intentioned, and in some cases very wise and successful, to work with ranchers and figure out, okay, how can we, this is the use we've chosen for this land, how can we do it sustainably, as a society? But I think that there are times, especially now that the climate is changing, where you have to broaden the discussion and say, is this the right use of the land in ecological terms? Is this going to serve our society in the long term? Or we don't have to draw a boundary around it and say, there can be no more human uses here, but is there another use?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and also I'm thinking about, I teach a climate change class at John Carroll, and I talk to the students about, migration of species, like by way of climate change. Like either you go up the mountain if you're a high elevation critter and you get to the top and there's nowhere else to go, so then you're done, or you go up a latitude if you're flora and fauna that can do that. And I'm wondering, there's a lot of talk. I know, like where I went at the University of Vermont, they're talking about moving red oak and red spruce northward, or they're doing some cool garden experiments to look at tolerance of different conditions. A lot of focus on like flora and their migration as a function of climate. But has anyone looked from a conservation standpoint at the migration of like fauna and what that could look like?
Yeah, definitely. And let's see, this discussion of what was called assisted migration, sometimes it's called assisted colonization, that came up maybe in the early 2000s, late 1990s, and was considered a bit radical at the time, though I think that there always has been some, different forms of assisted migration that weren't called that. Fish biologists will tell you people have been moving fish species around for many years as the climate has changed. I think that there are cases where it might benefit highly endangered species to be moved to more hospitable habitats as the climate's changing. I mean, I think we can, there are cases that people have identified where, if species are highly restricted to a certain habitat, and if the climate changes there, they're going to blink out. So it might well be a good idea to move a species, with caution, to a habitat that it's going to find more hospitable. But I think those are special restricted cases. I don't think people are going to want to be, putting species in a bucket and moving them around, on a regular basis. The place where I think that we are going to see big changes is in restoration work, in restoring habitats after wildfires, for instance, or after other kinds of disasters or transformations of the landscape. I think, restoration biologists are already talking a lot about this. Does it make sense to plant, say, another species of, to encourage another species of tree or another species of shrub to come back that's going to do better, given that the average temperature or the climate, another aspect of the climate, has changed since the habitat that used to be there was established?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and also too, like the pine beetle, or like, what's happening with the ponderosa pine and when I think about that, I also think about like the California and the intensity of the fires that are happening now. And like what is that doing to the soil chemistry and biology? And like, can you even like this is not, this isn't forest succession. This is like intense forest succession, which, as you said, it's like, who even knows that these species could handle that kind of changes in their environment? So it's just an interesting topic, because I was reading this article from the University of Vermont about what, like the resources going into the study, which I see as a valuable contribution, but still it's like, as you said, like, is this something we can, writ large do? Like, I don't know about that. So it seems it's kind of complicated. I wanted to kind of go back. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm very wary of the word natural because it means different things to different people, and often we don't even know what it means. But I think there has been a disruption in the predictable cycles of disturbance and recovery, and we can no longer predict them with the confidence that we used to be able to predict them. And it's worth taking those into account. And I think, in terms of the ethical questions that these things raise, often people say, oh, well, we shouldn't be playing God. And I think, well, we've been playing God since we've been playing God for many centuries at least. And we've been doing damage to other species and other ecosystems. And it might be our ethical responsibility to fight through some of these very uncomfortable questions, and to figure out what we can do to make up for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the bison example, I'm actually going out to the Standing Rock tribe in the fall, and I'm going to get to go around with the guy that runs their herd. And I'm going to get to meet some of their bison. So I'm super pumped about that this intertribal thing that they're doing. It's kind of seems like it's got a lot of value to it.
Yeah, that's a particularly exciting project, what they're up to. And yeah, there's so many tribes that are bringing herds of bison back to their ancestral land or their reservation land. And it's just clear even to an outsider how meaningful it is culturally and socially.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you, you were talking, when we were talking about the bison, one of the things I wanted to ask about was the idea that I guess in 1874, Congress had tried to curb the slaughter of the bison. They had tried to pass legislation, and Grant vetoed that by way of, I guess, was it Delano, his Secretary of Interior? I guess.
Yep.
I'm wondering who wanted to pass those bills, why, and why was it vetoed by Grant? I never heard that.
Yeah, there was there was concern about the bison brought to public attention by Hornaday and his predecessors, often big game hunters who knew something about what was going on in the plains, brought those concerns back to the urban public in North America. So there was concern, and you said in 1874, I'm trying to remember the date cited in my own book, but that's when the legislation was brought to Congress to protect bison, because at that time, it was recognized by some that it was possible that we would lose this species. But there was a, not always loudly articulated, but there was a sense that because the U.S. Army was in the process of nearly exterminating the indigenous people of the plains, that it would be convenient if the bison population continued to drop. And it's, horrible to think about today. And I think even at the time, it was recognized as something that shouldn't be spoken too loudly, but that was the thinking. And one of the people who did articulate it was Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior.
Wow.
So that was, and Grant's Secretary of the Interior. And I think that was a significant obstacle to those very early attempts to protect or to stop the, basically unfettered market hunting of the bison. Yeah. It's horrendous.
Yeah. And I know that any discussion about conservation in the United States wouldn't be complete without talking about a couple of people, which I know are probably near and dear to your heart. I'm thinking about Aldo Leopold and E.O. Wilson as two examples. Leopold is like, I hold him like way up there on my list. Sand County Almanac is mine, is so worked through and underlined for so many amazing quotes, and his connection to the sand hills of Wisconsin was just amazing. But like what how is it possible to underestimate the role that Leopold played back earlier and Wilson has played today in conservation, pushing the movement forward? And yeah, just your general take on maybe those two specifically.
Yeah, Leopold is a lot closer to my heart. I appreciate E.O. Wilson's communication powers. He certainly brought the concept of biodiversity to a lot of people, but I also think that I think that there are ways in which he could have emphasized the connection between people and nature even more, and that's something I wish that's something I see that Leopold did back in his day. And there's so much that he has to say that's so relevant to the conservation movement today, because when he talks about the land ethic, famously talks about the need for a land ethic, he's talking about the need for ordinary people to live sustainably alongside other species outside of traditional parks and reserves. And that to me is the great remaining challenge of the conservation movement. And it's the biggest challenge that the conservation movement has. And, E.O. Wilson, I think, showed a lot of people of what was at stake. But he was less, because his background was, and I'm not saying that was not worthwhile. His background was as a scientist, and talk about bringing attention to non-charismatic species as a specialist in ant colonies and ant social systems. Yeah. He was able to open the wonder of those hidden worlds to people. So that was very important. But because I see this great unmet challenge of conservation, my interest tends to be in Leopold and what Leopold had to say, because I think we're still not really paying attention to that. And we're still not finding ways for people to see themselves as part of an ecosystem. We've preserved a lot of amazing places. That people can go and see, an abundance of all kinds of species, but we have not really revived or revitalized that natural, I think, to use a loaded word, we have not revitalized that land ethic that I think most people do have at some level. As we talked about, I think people do have a connection to their home ecosystems and they care about them. The conservation movement, for whatever reason, has not yet been able to translate that connection into real action, into real care for people's home landscapes.
Yeah. And it's funny because there's a woman who having gone to school for way too long, I read a lot of textbooks, and the one book from an ecological standpoint that moved me beyond any of them was one I actually read a couple of years ago. A woman named May Thielgard Watts. Do you know who she is?
No, I don't.
She was at the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, and she wrote this book, Reading the Landscape of America, and her illustrations, and having read Leopold a lot like you, it's like I was like, oh, this Midwestern woman and this Midwestern guy, they really tapped into something. So having moved to the Midwest, I had a little bit Midwest pride there, but it was like there's something about that, like that way of speaking and communicating that he had and that I think she has. It's like it doesn't come across as disconnected from a large chunk of the country. So I'm very sympathetic of like what you were saying about like some of how the way science, and I think what you're also saying is science communication, ecological science communication has a long way to go to kind of connect with a larger, science communication is it seems like whether it's climate or conservation, it does seem very far removed in many respects from like the day-to-day of people. Especially in, when they're just kind of like, they're just trying to live their lives. And it's like, So I guess there's a long way to go with that, but it sounds like what you're saying is Leopold was able to make that connection kind of because he was of it, right?
Well, yeah, he was from the Midwest himself. He as a young forester in the Southwest, he witnessed the effects of overgrazing, overuse of the land. Kind of short term. Serving short-term interests in management decisions. He lived through the Dust Bowl, so he saw the consequences of mismanagement of private land, and he knew it was possible for people to act otherwise. And I think that, yeah, he was able to communicate that in his writing, not just by translating scientific principles, but by talking to ordinary people as an ordinary person. And I think that was one of his gifts. And I think, it's really easy today, because conservation has long been seen as the business of science. It's easy for us to forget that it's necessarily done by people. and we need, just as much as we need ecology and biology and an understanding of those principles, we need an understanding of social sciences and the humanities, and a sense, conservationists need a sense for themselves as, humans, just like other humans, with human needs. And we need to be able to talk at that level and speak to those very real concerns, because, like I said, conservation is performed by people, and so it needs to be a broad movement that includes most people, not just an elite.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions about this, and one is, I recently read a book about John James Audubon by Richard Rhodes. What is it called? The Making of an American.
Yes.
It was a really good book. And talks about the feather wars in that book. And I know that that was a big deal. I mean, again, as far as the extirpation of many birds in North America, the feather wars was a big deal. And out of it came, I think we were talking about, women like Rosalie Edge and some of the work that she did in Hawk Mountain. And if you know Hawk Mountain, you know that, Rachel Carson visited Hawk Mountain. And if you know Rachel Carson, you know that Silent Spring is maybe one of the most important books written in this country. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, the feather wars, and what led to Carson's kind of come to Jesus moment around conservation.
Well, first of all, I'll say that John James Audubon is the subject of a very recent and still live debate within the Audubon Society that's very interesting to look into. Oh. I was just spending time with some I was at a journalism conference with some members of the Audubon staff, and was getting an earful about their very modern debate about history. So I recommend you track down those articles.
I'm going to.
It raises a lot of the questions we've been talking about. So the feather wars, yes, were a real turning point in the conservation movement in North America. And like we were talking about, the very first generation of the conservation movement in North America was mostly led by elite white male trophy hunters, and the feather wars brought women into the conservation movement as never before, and many of them had gained their activist skills in the suffrage movement, successfully winning the vote for women nationwide in 1919. And at the same time, technological innovations, the availability of cheap binoculars allowed people to see birds without shooting them. So there was this huge rise in people recreationally looking at birds. Many of these women had done that. They appreciated the beauty of living birds. And so when hats with feathers on them became very fashionable, and this was a fad that's come and gone throughout history. It sort of rose again in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and there were these ridiculous hats with giant plumes that just got bigger and bigger every season. And these women who loved birds, and many of whom had experience with political activism, saw this happening. They said, "Well, this is ridiculous. This is this is surely killing off, huge populations of these birds that we love and appreciate. And they really led the way in fighting for legislation that protected wild birds. Because, it's hard to imagine now, but at the time, there was really no limit on how many birds you could shoot. And they succeeded in passing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which still exists today. It's still one of our strongest conservation laws. And that protects birds from commercial hunting. And that was an enormous victory. And you can look in the Volunteer Audubon Society surveys in the years after that law was passed, and you can just see the numbers. You can look at the records from Florida, where a lot of these showy birds were being shot and killed, and you can see the numbers, go up and up and up. So it worked, and it's one of the reasons why we still have some very healthy populations of very beautiful birds today. So that was a broadening of the conservation movement that happened decades ago, and really changed the movement in terms of who was part of it and in terms of what species they were concerned about, because it started to be about much more than charismatic mammals. Right. And so we know that kind of broadening, and we know that kind of broadening of interest and of mission is possible. And I think we're seeing it happen again. I'm not sure it's happening quickly enough, but I do feel like the conservation movement is going through another evolution like that. That's very exciting, actually, for me to be watching. And even in the years since I've written this book, not that I had anything to do with it, but I've seen the interests of the conservation movement change and broaden in directions that I think are very, very positive and very productive.
Yeah, songbirds are one category of bird that are like, yeah, I was actually just out birding for the first time in a couple of weeks, and I saw palm warblers and red-headed woodpeckers this morning. I had a good morning this morning, but definitely you've seen those numbers. Cornell's doing amazing work on covering that. So there's a lot of things, but I guess I'd like to kind of close by just not being kind of looking at some of the positives, some of the like good things that are coming out of this movement. And maybe I have a couple that I was thinking of, and I'd love to hear from you. One is, America's bald eagle population nesting pairs keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. We have 2 nesting pairs here in Cleveland, right downtown, basically. I go birding over in near Point Clinton, Ohio, and the bald eagles are everywhere. So bald eagles, speaking back to that toxic masculinity and our American flag and a symbol of the United States, it's amazing. I wish that the people that have those things on their Twitter handle would be involved in this movement, but I doubt they are. So that's a good positive. I was also reading that the monarch butterfly, which is also on the cover of your book, there's a study from the University of Georgia that says that the monarch butterfly populations might be on the rebound. So those are a couple. And I'm wondering, do you see any bright spots in the movement, in the conservation movement, maybe for species or ecosystems or both?
Yeah, I see. I think there are definitely single species success stories. There are. One of the reasons I wrote this book is I felt that conservationists were not learning from their past, because they were understandably always focused on the emergencies ahead. And I think it's important to look back, not only to say, oh, well, here's where we missed something, or here's where we were not aware of something, or here's where we failed. It's also important to look back and say, well, here's where we succeeded. And it's true that there are many species on the planet today that would not be here were it not for the efforts of conservationists. Bald eagles are one of them. Most bird species, that's another huge success. The bison is another that we talked about. I think, the bright spots that I see are some of the things we referred to already. The indigenous leadership of the bison restoration effort I think that's just really something that should be looked at and emulated more broadly, because I think it's a way to include people in conservation who have been historically excluded from modern conservation, and seeing people who have been historically excluded from conservation, leading a conservation effort that's not only a single species protection effort, but an ecosystem restoration effort, that to me has the ingredients that we need going forward to protect not only species but ecosystems, and protect not only ecosystems but ourselves in the face of really huge and unpredictable changes in our climate.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm hopeful. I mean, I have 2 little boys, so I have to be hopeful. But I've tried to point out some of these things to them too, because it's like to the original point we were talking about. It's like nothing captivates the mind of a child like a large animal. So it's nice that we can actually show them some large animals that are on the rebound. So that's really great. Well, Michelle, I really appreciate your time. I really do. I appreciate the book, and we're really looking forward to having you tomorrow. As part of our Distinguished Speaker Series, 3 p.m. You can find that at www.fact.org. So, Michelle, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to having you tomorrow.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Okay, bye-bye.
You've been listening to Just the Facts, a podcast of Fact Ohio. Faith communities together for a sustainable future. To learn more about Fact Ohio's mission, visit us at factohio.org. That's FACTOHIO.org. Until next time.